Mercy is a dangerous currency. When you offer grace to a normal human being, it inspires deep, permanent gratitude. When you offer grace to a narcissist, it inspires contempt. A narcissist does not possess the psychological architecture to understand forgiveness. They view it as a mathematical error. They view it as a weakness begging to be exploited. 6 months had passed since the Windsor Pavilion gala. 6 months since Natalyia Crane, a simple waitress wearing a champagne-soaked uniform, inherited the literal ground beneath Mark Edgewood's feet. She had stood in the center of that silent ballroom. She had held the absolute power to destroy him. And she had chosen mercy. She allowed the Edgewood Shipping Corporation to keep its headquarters. She honored the 99-year lease. She walked away. It was a beautiful poetic gesture. But poetry does not survive in the boardroom. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the sovereign principality of Thornmere did not operate on poetry. It operated on absolute unbreakable law. Thornmere was a fortress of ancient stone and modern terrifying wealth. The freezing winds from the channel battered the high palace walls. Inside, the fires burned hot. Natalyia was no longer carrying trays of crystal glasses. She was carrying the crushing weight of a royal bloodline. The transition was brutal. The Grand Duchess did not coddle her newly discovered sister. She forged her. Every morning began in the royal archives. Natalyia studied international trade law. She studied generational wealth management. She studied the cold, ruthless mathematics of statecraft. She learned how to read a corporate balance sheet like a military sniper reads a wind gauge. The waitress was slowly, meticulously dying. The Princess of Thornmere was taking her first steady breaths. And, standing beside her, an unwavering anchor in the storm of her new reality, was Leo Granger. He was no longer wearing the white uniform of a kitchen porter. He wore the sharp bespoke suits of a royal advisor. He had defended her when she was nobody. Now he advised her when she was everything. His storm grey eyes watched the global markets. His sharp mind protected her blind spots. They were building a partnership forged in absolute trust. But trust is a completely foreign concept in La Jolla, California. The sun still shined on the Edgewood shipping headquarters. The Pacific Ocean still sparkled. And Mark Edgewood was still breathing. The social execution he suffered at the gala had been agonizing. For 3 months, he was a ghost in his own city. The elite circles of San Diego had shunned him. But memory is incredibly short when money is involved. Slowly, quietly, the invitations returned. The business lunches resumed. The parasite found its way back into the host. And as his social standing recovered, his ego returned with terrifying velocity. Mark stood in his corner office looking out over the 17 acres of prime coastal real estate. He did not feel gratitude toward Natalyia. He felt deep, burning resentment. To survive the memory of his public humiliation, his mind had constructed a new, comfortable lie. He convinced himself that her mercy was actually stupidity. She was just a waitress, he reasoned, pacing the expensive hardwood floors. She was intimidated by the heavy paperwork. She was afraid to disrupt a major corporation. She didn't choose mercy. She chose avoidance. She was weak. This delusion became his new oxygen. It had to. Because Edgewood Shipping was secretly bleeding to death. Mark had made catastrophic, arrogant investments in overseas logistics. The company was drowning in quiet, toxic debt. He needed a massive influx of cash to satisfy his relentless creditors. He needed a miracle. He looked down at the sprawling shipping yards. He looked at the massive warehouses sitting on Thornmere land. The land he leased for absolute pennies on the dollar due to a decades-old agreement. He formulated a plan, or a highly illegal, desperately arrogant plan. He would sublease a massive portion of the coastal property. A foreign tech conglomerate was desperate for a West Coast distribution hub. They were willing to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for the access. It was enough money to wipe out his debt and restore his empire instantly. There was only one problem. The original 1983 lease agreement was absolute. It contained a microscopic ironclad clause. It strictly forbade any subleasing of the land without the explicit written consent of the Thornmere Crown. To do so was a fundamental breach of contract. Mark pulled the original lease from his hidden wall safe. He read the restrictive clause. He laughed. A hollow echoing sound in his expensive office. Why would he ask for permission? Why would he alert the palace to his financial vulnerability? He believed the Grand Duchess was too busy ruling a European country to notice a meaner real estate transaction in California. And he believed Natalyia was too uneducated to understand commercial property law. They were thousands of miles away. They were entirely disconnected from his reality. He would sign the sublease. He would take the foreign conglomerate's money. He would save his failing empire. He would hide the transaction behind thick layers of shell companies and non-disclosure agreements. He called his lead attorneys into the office. He gave the order. He instructed them to draft the contracts. He instructed them to bury the financial trail under a mountain of corporate jargon. He was gambling his entire legacy on a single arrogant assumption. He assumed the waitress was not watching. It is the ultimate fatal flaw of the narcissist. They believe they are the only ones playing the game. They believe everyone else is a background character existing purely for their manipulation. Mark Edgewood signed the preliminary agreements. He accepted a massive non-refundable deposit. He toasted his own fabricated genius with a glass of vintage scotch. He believed he had outsmarted a royal dynasty. He had absolutely no idea that every single keystroke, every single wire transfer, every single whisper in his boardroom was already being watched. Numbers are the purest form of truth in the universe. They do not possess an ego. They do not hold grudges. They do not care about social status. And they never ever lie. While Mark Edgewood was drinking vintage scotch and celebrating his fabricated genius in California, Leo Granger was quietly doing the math. Deep within the ancient, heavily fortified stone walls of the Thornmere Palace, there was a room dedicated entirely to the Principality's global assets. It was not a cozy, dusty library. It was a state-of-the-art financial war room. Massive digital monitors glowed in the dim light. Encrypted servers hummed quietly in the background. Outside, the freezing rain lashed violently against the heavy, bulletproof glass of the arched windows. Leo sat at a massive oak table completely surrounded by digital ledgers. He was currently running a routine quarterly audit of the Crown's California holdings. He was doing exactly the job he was born to do. He was looking for microscopic fractures in the financial foundation. He found a massive gaping crater. It did not look like a crater at first glance. Mark's attorneys were incredibly expensive. They had buried the illegal transaction beneath 6 layers of complex shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. They had cleverly disguised the incoming capital as a series of decentralized private commercial loans. But Leo was not easily fooled by corporate smoke and mirrors. He followed the digital paper trail. He tracked the origin of the foreign funds. He analyzed the specific dates of the offshore wire transfers. He cross-referenced the capital influx with the local commercial real estate filings in San Diego County. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Mark Edgewood was not securing loans. He was accepting a massive, highly illegal down payment from a foreign tech conglomerate. He was actively, secretly subleasing the 17 acres of Point Loma coastline, the very land Natalyia had mercifully allowed him to keep. Leo did not feel anger. Anger is an emotional response, and emotions that cloud judgment. Leo felt absolute ice-cold precision. He printed the encrypted documents. He gathered the heavy stack of paper. He placed it inside a dark, unmarked leather folder. He walked out of the war room. His footsteps echoed down the long, shadowed corridors of the palace. He navigated the sprawling labyrinth of ancient wealth until he reached the royal study. He knocked once. He pushed open the heavy oak doors. Natalyia was sitting at the massive desk. She was currently reading a thick, leather-bound volume on international maritime law. The champagne-soaked waitress from the Windsor Pavilion was completely permanently gone. She wore a simple, elegant, dark cashmere sweater. Her posture was perfectly straight, forged by months of intense royal protocol. The heavy gold signet ring rested securely on her right hand. She looked up as Leo entered. Her Arctic blue eyes softened instantly. "You look serious," Natalyia said quietly. "I'm always serious," Leo replied. His British accent was smooth, but it carried a heavy, undeniable weight. He walked directly to the desk. He placed the dark leather folder precisely in the center of the polished wood. "What is this?" Natalyia asked. "This is the price of mercy," Leo answered. Natalyia opened the folder. She looked at the top document. It was a complex web of financial transfers, meticulously highlighted in red ink. She possessed the brutal training now. She could read the numbers just as well as he could. She traced the red lines with her finger. She saw the name of the foreign conglomerate. She saw the staggering sum of money, $300 million. Then she saw the signature at the very bottom of the preliminary agreement. Mark Edgewood. "He is subleasing the Point Loma property," Leo stated. His voice was a calm, steady rhythm reciting the facts of a crime. "He is granting a foreign entity full commercial access to the shipping yards to build a West Coast distribution hub. He has already accepted a non-refundable deposit of $50 million to cover his toxic failing debt." Natalyia stared at the signature. The ink seemed to physically burn against the white paper. "The 1983 lease agreement strictly forbids this," Natalyia said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "He cannot sublease without explicit royal consent. It is a fundamental breach of contract." "He did not ask for consent," Leo confirmed. "He intentionally buried the transaction. He assumed you would not notice. He assumed you were not looking." A sudden sharp sting of profound betrayal pierced Natalya's chest. It was not the betrayal of a broken heart. That wound had healed long ago. It was a deep psychological insult to her intelligence. She had spared him. She had stood in front of 300 elite guests and handed him back his entire life. She had given him the ultimate profound gift of grace. And he had taken that grace, laughed at it behind closed doors, and immediately used it to try and steal her kingdom. "He thinks I'm stupid," Natalyia whispered, her grip tightening on the edge of the desk. "No," a new powerful voice echoed through the quiet study. Natalyia and Leo turned in unison. The Grand Duchess stood in the doorway. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit. Her mere presence instantly shifted the gravity of the room. She was the absolute breathing embodiment of sovereign power. She walked slowly toward the desk. "He does not think you are stupid, Natalyia," the Grand Duchess corrected smoothly. "He simply thinks you are weak." The Grand Duchess stopped at the edge of the desk. She looked down at the open leather folder. She did not look surprised. She possessed a global intelligence network. She already knew exactly what was in the files. She had simply been waiting for her sister to see the truth for herself. "You offered mercy to a snake," the Grand Duchess said, her arctic blue eyes locking onto Natalyia. "And you expected the snake to suddenly become a loyal dog. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of nature." Natalyia looked down at her hands. The gold signet ring felt incredibly heavy. "I wanted to be better than him," Natalyia defended herself quietly. "I wanted to prove that ultimate power does not require absolute cruelty." "And you did," the Grand Duchess agreed softly. "Mercy is a beautiful, necessary crown and jewel. But mercy without consequence is just permission." The older sister leaned forward. The air in the room grew completely terrifyingly still. He did not see a benevolent, merciful ruler that night at the pavilion. The Grand Duchess explained, delivering a brutal masterclass in the psychology of narcissism. He saw a waitress playing dress-up. He saw a woman too intimidated by her own sudden power to actually use it. When you walked away and honored the lease, he did not feel gratitude. He felt relief. And then he felt absolute arrogant contempt. Every single word landed with flawless, undeniable precision. Natalyia felt the final lingering shadows of her old life evaporating. The girl who had carried trays, the girl who had apologized for taking up space, the girl who had tolerated blatant disrespect. She was actively permanently dying right there in the royal study. "He is currently planning a massive corporate gala," Leo added, looking down at the encrypted tablet in his hand. "At the Point Loma headquarters. It is scheduled for this Friday night. He is going to publicly announce the new partnership with the foreign developers. He is going to use your land to permanently secure his fabricated legacy. Mark was going to throw a massive party on stolen ground. He was going to stand in front of the California elite and celebrate his successful arrogant theft." Natalyia looked back down at the signature. Mark Edgewood. The man who had deliberately tripped her. The man who had dropped $100 bill in a puddle of champagne. The man who truly believed he could outsmart an ancient crown. The profound, agonizing truth finally settled deeply into her bones. You cannot negotiate with pure arrogance. You cannot reform a narcissist with kindness. You can only stop them. You can only dismantle them. You must force them to face the absolute crushing reality of their own irrelevance. Natalyia slowly closed the dark leather folder. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a heavy vault locking shut. She stood up. The posture was no longer practiced. It was entirely natural. It was the terrifying, undeniable posture of a true monarch. Her eyes were no longer the soft, forgiving blue of a California morning. They were the hard, freezing ice of the Atlantic Ocean. The waitress was dead. The Princess of Thornmere was fully awake. "What is your command, sister?" the Grand Duchess asked quietly. A proud, incredibly dangerous smile touched her lips. Natalyia did not look at her sister. She looked directly at Leo. "Leo," Natalyia commanded. Her voice was flat, cold, hypnotic. "Draft a formal declaration of forfeiture. Cite the specific unarguable breach of the 1983 sublease clause." Leo's storm grey eyes flashed with dark, absolute satisfaction. "Yes, Your Highness. And the delivery method shall I engage the Royal Legal Counsel in Washington?" "No," Natalyia stated. The rhythm of her words was absolute. "I will not send a letter. I will not send an army of lawyers. A narcissist requires an audience for their execution." She stepped around the heavy oak desk. "We are flying back to California. We are attending a gala. Arrogance is a loud, desperate disease. It requires a constant, deafening soundtrack of applause to drown out the quiet truth of its own fragility. Mark Edgewood was hosting the loudest party of his life. The Point Loma shipping yards had been transformed. Massive, transparent pavilions were erected directly on the docks. The Pacific Ocean crashed against the retaining walls, a dark, rhythmic backdrop to the glittering illusion of infinite wealth. Hundreds of the California elite were in attendance. Politicians, tech billionaires, and most importantly, the foreign executives of the conglomerate he was actively defrauding the crown to impress. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd. They carried silver trays of vintage champagne. Mark did not look at the waiters. He did not see them as human beings. To him, they were just moving furniture. 6 months ago, one of those moving pieces of furniture had inherited his world. Tonight, he was reclaiming it. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo. Midnight blue, the uniform of a man who believed that he had successfully cheated death. He stood in the center of the main pavilion, surrounded by a tight circle of foreign investors. He was holding a crystal glass. He was laughing. It was a booming, arrogant, deeply hollow sound. "The West Coast is the future," Mark bragged, gesturing expansively toward the massive cargo ships docked in the harbor. "And this property is the absolute crown jewel. You will not find 17 contiguous acres of deep water access anywhere else in the state." The lead investor, a sharp, calculating man in a grey suit, nodded slowly. "The location is flawless, Mr. Edgewood, but our legal team expressed minor concerns regarding the land deed. It is technically a leasehold." Mark smiled, a wide, predatory, deeply ignorant smile. "A technicality." Mark dismissed, waving his free hand, as if swatting away a fly. "A piece of ancient, irrelevant paper. My grandfather signed a 99-year lease. We control the land. We control the air rights. We control the future. The actual owners..." He paused, letting out a soft, condescending chuckle. "They are completely disconnected from modern commerce. They are European aristocrats. They live in stone castles and wear heavy crowns. They do not understand global logistics. We will build your distribution hub, and they will simply collect their microscopic rent check. They are entirely irrelevant." He believed every single word. He believed he had successfully bypassed the ironclad laws of an ancient principality. He believed his offshore shell companies were an impenetrable fortress. He tapped his crystal glass against a silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing echoed through the pavilion. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded into expectant silence. Mark walked toward the raised stage at the end of the pavilion. He stepped up to the acrylic podium. The microphone amplified his breathing. He looked out over the sea of wealthy, powerful faces. He felt the intoxicating, blinding rush of absolute ego. He had survived the social exile. He had secured the capital. He was the undisputed king of the coast. "Welcome!" Mark's voice boomed over the speakers, rolling across the docks. "Welcome to the new era of Edgewood shipping." The crowd clapped politely. "We stand on historic ground tonight." Mark continued, his tone dripping with rehearsed confidence. "But history is only valuable if you know how to leverage it. For 3 generations, my family has commanded this coastline. We built an empire. And tonight we announce a partnership that will expand that empire across the globe." He gestured toward the foreign investors. They raised their glasses in acknowledgement. "Some people believe power is inherited," Mark said, leaning closer to the microphone. His voice took on a sharp, bitter edge. It was a veiled insult meant entirely for his own psychological satisfaction. They believe power is a title handed down by accident of birth. But real power is built. Real power takes risks. Real power is having the vision to take what is yours regardless of the outdated rules written by irrelevant people. He was mocking the crown. He was mocking the very women who had mercifully spared his company 6 months prior. He raised his glass high into the air. "To the future," Mark declared, "and to the bold." The crowd raised their glasses. "To the bold," they echoed. Mark smiled. He prepared to take a triumphant sip of champagne. Before the crystal touched his lips, the pavilion lights flickered. It was a subtle shift in the electrical current, but it was enough to draw the attention of the crowd toward the massive, open entrance of the glass tent. A low, heavy, resonant vibration began to build in the air. It was not the crashing of the ocean waves. It was the synchronized purr of multiple V-12 engines. A motorcade was approaching. The crowd parted instinctively as the vehicles rolled directly under the restricted private docks. 3 identical midnight blue Bentleys glided to a flawless stop in front of the pavilion. The vehicles did not bear standard California license plates. They bore heavy embossed diplomatic plates. Mounted on the hood of the lead vehicle was a small, unmistakable flag, a crowned shield flanked by lions. The sovereign crest of Thornmere, Mark Edgewood, froze. The champagne glass hovered inches from his mouth. His heart rate spiked violently. A sudden freezing wave of panic crashed into his chest. Why were they here? They were supposed to be 3,000 miles away. They were supposed to be irrelevant. The doors of the first and third vehicles opened simultaneously. 8 men stepped out. They were not wearing standard security suits. They wore the formal, terrifyingly precise dark uniforms of the Thornmere Royal Guard. They moved with absolute silent synchronicity. They formed a perfect, unyielding perimeter around the center vehicle. The crowd in the pavilion was completely, utterly silent. The tech billionaires, the politicians, the elite socialites, they all recognized true apex power when it arrived. The air in the tent became suddenly suffocating. One of the guards stepped forward. He reached for the handle of the center Bentley. He opened the door. The silence deepened. It became a physical weight pressing down on the docks. A man stepped out first. It was Leo Granger. He was no longer pushing a cleanup cart. He wore a flawless bespoke charcoal suit. He wore a discreet earpiece. His storm grey eyes swept over the massive silent crowd, assessing every single threat with cold military precision. His gaze locked onto Mark standing at the podium. Leo did not smile. He simply extended his hand back toward the open door of the Bentley. The waitress did not step out. The Princess of Thornmere arrived. Natalyia Crane emerged into the cool California night. She was not wearing a simple dress. She was not wearing the champagne-soaked uniform of her past. She had not come to negotiate. She had come to execute. She wore a tailored floor-length coat of deep navy wool cut with military precision. The collar was sharp. The silhouette was flawless. Across her chest she wore a single subtle sash of crimson silk. Resting against her collarbone was a heavy, ancient diamond pendant. On her right hand, the heavy gold signet ring caught the ambient light of the pavilion. She looked breathtaking. She looked immortal. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the foreign investors. She looked directly at Mark Edgewood. Her arctic blue eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a judge walking into a condemned man's cell. Mark's hand began to tremble. The crystal glass shook violently. Champagne sloshed over the rim, spilling onto his expensive velvet tuxedo. He did not notice. The arrogant delusion he had built over the last 6 months began to crack, fracture, and shatter in real time. He had assumed she was weak because she had shown mercy. He had assumed she was irrelevant because she was quiet. He realized, staring into the terrifying absolute calm of her eyes, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had not been hiding from him. She had been studying him. Natalyia walked forward. Leo walked 1/2 step behind her left shoulder. The Royal Guard flanked them, creating an impenetrable wall of physical force. The crowd parted. They did not just step aside. They physically retreated, pressing themselves against the glass walls of the pavilion. to create a wide, undeniably clear path for the monarch. The heavy rhythmic click of Natalyya's heels against the wooden dock echoed in the dead silence. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a ticking clock reaching 0. Mark tried to speak. He tried to summon his silver tongue. He tried to project the booming, confident voice he had used just 2 minutes prior. His vocal cords were paralyzed. The absolute suffocating terror of consequence had finally caught up to him. Natalyia stopped exactly 10 feet from the acrylic podium. She looked at the massive glass pavilion. She looked at the foreign investors standing frozen near the stage. She looked at the champagne spilling onto Mark's hands. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. It was a psychological torture tactic, designed to strip away every remaining shred of his ego. Finally, Natalyia spoke. She did not use a microphone. Her voice was not loud. It was soft, hypnotic, and completely terrifyingly lethal. You throw a very loud party, Mr. Edgewood. Natalyia said the quiet syllables, cutting through the thick air like a razor blade. She tilted her head, slightly. The diamond pendant caught the light. It is a shame, she whispered, her eyes locking onto his terrified, trembling face, that you are trespassing on my property. Trespassing. The word echoed through the massive glass pavilion. It bounced against the steel beams. It rolled out over the dark, churning water of the Pacific Ocean. Mark Edgewood stood frozen at the podium. His brain violently misfired. When a narcissist is cornered by absolute undeniable truth, they experience a psychological short circuit. They cannot accept reality. To accept reality would require them to admit they are flawed. So their ego engages in a desperate, pathetic scramble to rewrite the narrative in real time. Mark looked at the foreign investors standing near the stage. He saw the confusion on their faces. He saw the capital, the hundreds of millions of dollars he desperately needed, threatening to walk out the door. He had to regain control. He had to prove to these billionaires that he was still the alpha in the room. He had to put the waitress back in her place. Mark forced a smile. There was a grotesque, unnatural stretching of his facial muscles. He set his spilled champagne glass down on the acrylic podium. He gripped the edges of the stand. He leaned into the microphone. Natalyia, Mark said. His tone was suddenly patronizing, sickeningly sweet. It was the tone of an adult addressing a confused, wandering child. What an incredibly dramatic entrance. We weren't expecting you. He let out a short, forced chuckle. It echoed awkwardly in the silent tent. No one else laughed. I appreciate you flying all this way to visit the property. Mark continued, his voice projecting over the speakers, trying to weave his illusion back together. But as you can see, we are in the middle of a very high-level corporate event. We are conducting complex international business. I know, all of this legal paperwork can be overwhelming for someone with your background. Why don't you wait in the VIP lounge? I will have my assistants bring you some champagne. I will gladly explain the logistics to you when the adults are finished talking. He had just patronized a sovereign monarch. He had just called her uneducated in front of 300 elite witnesses. He had tried to hand a glass of champagne to the woman who owned the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes. The crowd held its collective breath. They waited for the explosion. They waited for the royal guard to draw weapons. Natalyia did not explode. True power does not scream. True power does not throw tantrums. True power listens, observes, and then flawlessly executes. Natalyia simply looked at him. Her Arctic blue eyes did not blink. She walked forward. She bypassed the velvet ropes. She walked up the 3 short steps onto the raised stage. Leo Granger followed her, a silent, tailored shadow. The royal guard secured the perimeter of the stage. No one could leave. No one could intervene. Mark instinctively took a step back from the podium. His body recognized the danger, even if his ego refused to accept it. Natalyia stepped up to the acrylic stand. She did not adjust the microphone. It was perfectly positioned for her. She did not look at Mark. She looked out at the massive crowd. She looked directly at the circle of foreign investors standing in the front row. 6 months ago, Natalyia spoke into the microphone. Her voice was smooth, rhythmic, utterly mesmerizing. I stood in a ballroom across town. I was wearing a uniform. I was covered in broken glass, and the man standing behind me threw a $100 bill at my feet to pay for my humiliation. The silence in the pavilion was absolute. The guests remembered the gala. They remembered the cruelty. On that night, I discovered I was the sole heir to the Thornmere estate. Natalyia continued her tone, conversational, but carrying the heavy weight of an anvil. I discovered that my family owned the 17 acres of coastal land upon which Edgewood Shipping operates. I held the absolute authority to terminate the 99-year lease. I held the power to destroy him. She paused, a strategic, agonizing pose. I chose not to. I believed that mercy was the ultimate display of strength. I allowed the lease to remain active. I allowed him to keep his company. She turned her head slightly. She looked at the lead foreign investor, the sharp man in the grey suit. But mercy, Natalyia stated coldly, is a privilege reserved for those who understand honor. It is not a shield for corporate fraud. The lead investor frowned. His posture stiffened. Fraud, Your Highness. Mark lunged forward. Panic finally shattered his patronizing facade. Natalyia, stop! Mark hissed, reaching out to grab the microphone. You don't understand what you're doing. This is a private commercial transaction. You're ruining the deal. Before Mark's hand could touch the acrylic stand, Leo Granger moved. It was a blur of calculated kinetic violence. Leo stepped between Mark and the podium. He did not throw a punch. He simply placed his hand flat against Mark's chest and pushed. The force was immense. Mark stumbled backward, his highly polished shoes slipping on the wooden stage. He nearly fell. Do not approach the princess, Leo warned. His British accent was entirely stripped of its polite veneer. It was the voice of a man trained to break bones. Mark stayed back, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Natalyia did not even flinch. She kept her eyes on the foreign investors. She reached out her hand. Leo, without taking his eyes off Mark, smoothly placed a dark leather folder into Natalya's palm. Natalyia opened the folder on the podium. You are representing a global technology conglomerate. Natalyia addressed the lead investor. You are seeking a West Coast distribution hub. You were told that Edgewood Shipping controls the air rights and the development rights to this property. We were? The investor confirmed, his voice tight with rising suspicion. You were lied to, Natalyia stated flawlessly. She pulled a heavy, aged document from the folder. It bore the faded seals of a different century. This is the original 1983 commercial lease agreement between the Thornmere Trust and the Edgewood family. Natalyia announced. She did not yell. She let the microphone carry the execution. Section 4, paragraph 9, the subleasing clause. Mark's face drained of all color. He looked like a corpse wearing a velvet tuxedo. He knew exactly what she was about to read. I will read it verbatim, Natalyia said. She looked down at the paper. The lessee shall not assign transfer mortgage or sublease the whole or any part of the demised premises without the prior explicit and written consent of the sovereign crown of Thornmere. She looked up from the document. Her eyes locked onto Mark. Did you ask for my consent, Mark? The question hung in the air. It was a rhetorical guillotine. Mark opened his mouth. He closed it. He was drowning on dry land. Natalyia turned back to the investors. He did not, she answered for him. Instead, he deliberately concealed the transaction. He drafted illegal contracts. And 3 days ago, he accepted a non-refundables deposit of $50 million from your conglomerate, wired through 6 offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The lead investor's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He looked at Mark with pure, unadulterated corporate rage. They had been conned. They had wired $50 million to a man who did not possess the legal right to lease them, the dirt they were standing on. He is currently drowning in toxic maritime debt. Natalyia exposed stripping Mark naked in front of the entire California elite. He needed your capital to save his failing empire. He sold you a ghost. He committed massive, undeniable wire fraud. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Cell phones were immediately pulled out. The digital execution was happening in real time. Mark shook his head desperately. It's a misunderstanding. Mark pleaded, his voice cracking, the arrogant boom entirely gone. We can renegotiate. I can restructure the deal. Your Highness, please. We can bring the crown in as a primary partner. We can all profit. He was begging. The man who had thrown a $100 bill at her feet was now begging for his financial life. Natalyia looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. "You do not negotiate with a tumor," Natalyia said softly. "You extract it." She looked back down at the original lease agreement. Section 4, Paragraph 10, the penalty clause. The final nail hovered over the coffin. Any violation of the subleasing restriction constitutes a fundamental, incurable breach of a contract. Upon such breach, the lease is immediately null and void. She paused. She let the legal reality sink into the minds of the billionaires and politicians watching the slaughter. Furthermore, Natalyia read her voice ringing like a funeral bell. Upon termination due to breach, all physical assets, structures, equipment, and improvements remaining on the demised premises shall immediately forfeit to the sovereign crown of Thornmere without compensation. The silence returned. It was heavier this time. It was the silence of absolute catastrophic ruin. "Do you understand what that means, Mark?" Natalyia asked. She closed the leather folder. "It means you do not just lose the lease, you lose the buildings, you lose the cranes, you lose the massive cargo ships currently tethered to my docks. You forfeit every single physical asset your family has built over the last 40 years. She stepped away from the podium. She walked toward him. Mark instinctively shrank backward. He was terrified of her. He was terrified of the waitress he had tripped. "I offered you mercy." Natalyia whispered, her voice meant only for him, though the microphone caught the deadly chill of it. "And you mistook it for stupidity. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. You forgot who owned the room." She turned it back to him. She faced the silent, stunned crowd. "This gala is over," the Princess of Thornmere announced. She looked at the royal guard standing at the perimeter. "Clear my property." "The execution of a king does not require a guillotine. It only requires the absolute withdrawal of his power." When the Princess of Thornmere gave the order, the California elite did not hesitate. They did not rush to Mark Edgewood's defense. They scattered. Billionaires, politicians, and socialites moved toward the exits with terrifying synchronized speed. They were rats fleeing a sinking ship. The foreign investors, the men who had just realized they had wired $50 million to a ghost, were the very first to leave. Their corporate lawyers were already dialing numbers, preparing to tear whatever was left of Mark's life to absolute shreds. Within 10 minutes, the massive glittering glass pavilion was entirely empty of guests. The only people remaining were the royal guard, and Mark. He was standing exactly where Natalyia had left him. He looked incredibly small. The bespoke midnight blue velvet tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Two members of the royal guard approached him. They did not draw weapons. They did not need to. Their posture was a kinetic strike. "It is time to leave the premises, sir," the lead guard stated. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Mark looked around. He looked at the massive cranes towering over the shipping yards. He looked at the cargo ships rocking gently in the dark water. The ships bore his family's name. The buildings bore his family's legacy. And now, by the brutal, flawless mathematics of his own arrogance, they belonged to the waitress he had humiliated. "My office!" Mark stammered, his voice weak, trembling. "I need to get my things, my computer, my safe." "All physical assets remaining on the premises have been officially forfeited to the crown," the guard replied flawlessly. "You are permitted to leave with the clothes you are wearing. Nothing else." He had walked into the pavilion as a titan of industry. He was walking out as a trespasser with nothing but the lint in his pockets. The guards placed their heavy hands on his shoulders. They physically turned him around. They marched him down the long wooden dock. Mark Edgewood did not fight back. The psychological architecture of his ego had completely collapsed. He dragged his feet. He stared at the wooden planks. The absolute suffocating darkness of his new reality swallowed him whole. He was escorted past the main security gates. The heavy iron doors clanged shut behind him. He was locked out of his own life, permanently. Back inside the glass pavilion, the silence was profound. It was not the heavy, awkward silence of a ruined party. It was the sharp, crystalline silence of absolute victory. Natalyia stood on the raised stage. She looked out at the vast, empty shipping yards she now entirely possessed. She felt the heavy gold signet ring on her finger. It did not feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a weapon she had finally learned how to wield. Leo stepped up beside her. He did not say a word. He simply stood at her right side, a constant unyielding pillar of support. I wanted to show him mercy, Natalyia said quietly, her breath visible in the cool night air. You did? Leo replied, his storm-grey eyes looking out over the dark ocean. Mercy is a gift, but when a man throws a gift back in your face, you do not offer it a second time. You offer him the mirror. Natalyia turned to look at him. She saw the man who had knelt in the champagne and broken glass with her. She saw the man who had risked his own job to defend a stranger. He had not bowed to her when she was a waitress. He did not cower before her now that she was a princess. He was a true equal. We have a lot of ships to manage tomorrow. Leo, Natalyia said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. Indeed we do, Your Highness. Leo smiled back. I suggest we begin with a forensic audit of the cargo. I suspect Mr. Edgewood's bookkeeping is as sloppy as his manners. They walked off the stage together. They walked out of the glass pavilion. They stepped into the waiting Bentley. The motorcade pulled away, leaving the Edgewood shipping empire sitting silently in the dark under flawless new management. The architecture of power is a fascinating study in contrast. We are conditioned to fear the loud, to respect the arrogant, to believe that the people who shout the loudest, who wear the most expensive suits, are the ones who control the board. But true power is entirely silent. It is the intellect that quietly reads the fine print while the arrogant drink vintage champagne. It is the patience to watch a fool build a house of cards, knowing exactly which card to pull. Karma is not a mystical, invisible force. It is a legal document. It is a mathematical certainty. When you build your life on the suffering and humiliation of others, you are operating on borrowed time. And when you mistake mercy for weakness, you write your own death warrant. Let us pause. Listen to the silence in your own room. Think about the times you have offered forgiveness to someone who did not deserve it. Think about the people who took your grace and immediately used it to sharpen their knives in the dark. Now I want to ask you a profound, uncomfortable question. Look at the terrifying precision of Princess Natalyia. She gave him a second chance. He used it to try and steal her kingdom, so she took absolutely everything he owned. If you possessed her limitless power, if you had been betrayed by someone you mercifully spared, would you simply cancel the contract and walk away? Or would you orchestrate the ultimate public execution? Would you stand on a stage and legally strip them of their entire legacy, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back? Is Natalyia's revenge a masterpiece of justified karma? Or did she become just as ruthless as the man she destroyed? Tell me your exact answer in the comments below. Do not hold back. I read every single one. The world is full of loud, arrogant fools who believe they are untouchable. But the fine print always remembers who holds the pen. Until next time, stay silent, stay sharp. This is The Forgotten Maid.